That swelling sense of satisfaction you get when an excellently designed boss fight caps off a video game is one of the greatest parts of the gaming experience. But not all final bosses live up to their billing. Failing either from a storytelling perspective, or from a visual design perspective, or from a lack of challenge, or really all of the above. Final bosses that fall short of expectations can leave a sour taste in your mouth that's not easy to forget. Here, we're going to talk about a few such disappointments. Before we go ahead, please consider subscribing to our channel. We upload new videos every single day, and your support really helps us out. With that out of the way, let's start. Middle-earth: Shadow of Mordor. Shadow of Mordor sees you building up your character to ridiculous heights, but the payoff at the end of that long journey is incredibly disappointing. Taking on the Black Hand of Sauron after everything that Talion and Celebrimbor have been through should have felt like a climactic duel for the ages, and in the end it just ends up being a quick-time event. Who thought that that was a good idea? Mass Effect 2. The idea of a human-Reaper hybrid is a fascinating one, and purely from a narrative perspective, the final boss of Mass Effect 2 serves as a pretty fitting final enemy. As an actual fight though, it's quite disappointing. The human-Reaper hybrid didn't know how to do much other than shoot surprisingly tame lasers, and the random low-level grunts that kept spawning to craft an illusion of challenge were little more than a minor nuisance. The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild. Breath of the Wild is an absolutely incredible game, and we here at Gaming Vault have made no attempts to hide how much we love it, but it does have its flaws. One of its biggest issues is the complete lack of decent boss fights, which is the last thing you expect from a Zelda game, and the final fight is a perfect encapsulation of that flaw. Visual design is about the only area where it is not a disappointment. The fight against Calamity Ganon is disappointingly enough as it is, especially if you head into it with the 4 champions support. But the fight that follows in Hyrule Field against Dark Beast Ganon is even worse. It's a bland and ridiculously easy fight that does a disservice to the incredible game that precedes it, even though the music is incredible. Dark Souls. The Souls series lives and dies by its boss battles, and the vast majority of them are brilliant. There are still a few damp squibs though, and Gwyn, the final boss of the first Dark Souls, is one of them. It's not a bad boss battle per se, and when it comes to things such as lore and music, it's hard to find fault with it. But the sudden lack of challenge after the grueling journey you go through in the entire game feels a bit jarring. Super Mario Galaxy. Yeah, Mario games are, by design, not known for their boss fights, and the boss fights that they do have aren't particularly spectacular. Even so, the final encounter with Bowser in Super Mario Galaxy is a bit lackluster. There isn't much that's horribly wrong with it, but the big issue here is that it's essentially just a reskin of a similar fight you already have with Bowser earlier in the game. Repeat fights are never good, but when they're final bosses, they're even more disappointing. Batman: Arkham Knight. The Arkham series has delivered some truly excellent boss fights. This was, in fact, an area where the series grew progressively better with each game. Until Arkham Knight, that is. The few boss fights that the game did have were largely disappointing, the final fight against the titular Arkham Knight most of all. And the biggest reason for that was, of course, the Batmobile, with the game forcing ridiculously boring and inane tank chases and battles into boss fights that really would have been so much better if they were just good old-fashioned mano-a-mano duels. Batman: Arkham Asylum. It may not have been as bad as Batman's final duel against Jason Todd, but Arkham Asylum's last encounter against the Joker comes pretty damn close. More than anything else, it's the very premise of the fight that's responsible for that. The Joker is this criminal mastermind who thrives on messing with the Batman on a psychological level, and yet when you take him on in this climactic duel, he's turned himself into an enormous, muscular monstrosity. That's just not what we want to see from the Clown Prince of Gotham City. Yoshi's Story. Here's yet another example of a boss fight that doesn't do anything terribly wrong. Yoshi's final fight against Bowser Jr. just fails to do justice to the really good game that precedes it. It's just over too quickly, entirely bland, and making next to no impression. It doesn't feel like the fight is nearly as well designed as it needs to be to cap off an otherwise extremely great game. Dead Space. After the terrifying ordeal Isaac Clarke goes through throughout all of Dead Space, you'd expect the final boss fight of the game to be appropriately a nightmarish encounter. And sure, its visual design suggests that that's what it is, but when you get down to actually fighting it, it's actually sort of disappointing. Avoid the hive mind's tentacle attacks with ease. Bring one good weapon that's been maxed out, and the fight barely poses any challenge. Even on harder difficulties, it's easier than you'd expect. Half-Life. Half-Life might be one of the best and most influential games of all time, but even it has obvious, glaring flaws. The final fight against Nihilanth is probably one of the biggest. Its visual design is hilariously bad. It attempts to artificially manufacture challenge with cheap tactics, and yet, even so, it's ridiculously easy to just cheese your way through the fight without running into any issues. Not at all how you want a game as great as this to end. Monster Hunter Stories. Monster Hunter Stories was generally a really good spin on the Monster Hunter universe, and a charming JRPG that got lost in the noise because of its release date, which was late 2017 for a 3DS exclusive turn-based JRPG. Thankfully, the spin-off series gets a second chance with the upcoming Monster Hunter Stories 2 later this year. And as much as we're looking forward to it, we really hope Capcom gives it a better final boss than the one in the original, because Stories' final boss fight was not good. Unlike several other final bosses on this list, this one wasn't bad because it was really easy, but because of the exact opposite reason. It's freakishly a difficult battle, all but demanding that players have grinded up before they face off against the boss, and invested in some very specific armor that can help keep a lot of the boss's more damaging attacks at bay. And this is without getting into some of the one-hit kill attacks. We're all for great challenges on the final boss, but don't make the fight so impossibly difficult that players lose the motivation to complete the game at the literal last moment. Capcom, please. Resident Evil 7. With multiple fights against Jack Baker and one encounter against Marguerite, Resident Evil 7 actually has some really good boss fights, appropriately enough for a Resident Evil game. At the very end, however, the game stumbles. Ethan faces off against Evelyn and it looks bombastic as hell, but when you're actually playing the game, it's quite bland. There's no strategy, no challenge, no unique hook. You just shoot at the final boss until the cutscene plays. There's a severe disconnect between how climactic the final fight looks and how unengaging it actually is. Control. Get to high ground. That's the most crucial piece of advice you need to keep in mind in Control's final boss fight, which is also one of the game's most frustrating sections. Having to fight endless waves of enemies poses more of a challenge than you might be ready for, and while we're always up for a good challenge, Control verges on the point of being unfair with this stuff. The fact that it throws you all the way back to the beginning of the encounter every time you die does it no favors either. On top of that, it's also pretty disappointing that the final set-piece battle of the game is just a wave-based encounter against regular enemies. Pokemon Sword and Shield. Pokemon Sword and Shield are generally very easy games, in keeping with the Pokemon franchise's continued refusal to trust its players to do much more than press some buttons at intermittent intervals. To be entirely fair to the games, there are some bosses in the game that are actually fairly engaging, such as the Eternatus boss battle. And while Leon definitely counts as one of the relatively harder bosses, given the fact that he can actually knock out a Pokemon or two from your team before folding, on the whole, he is probably among the easiest champion fights in the series. In fact, the only reason we hesitate to say that he isn't the easiest is because Dianth in Pokemon X and Y was somehow even easier, which isn't really a reassuring thought that Pokemon has had such lame final bosses twice now. Demon Souls. It's been something of a pattern in this feature that we talk about disappointing final bosses in games with otherwise excellent boss fights, so it's fitting that we're ending on this note, because the final boss in Demon Souls is a bit of a joke. Taking on King Elant as he's in the midst of transforming into a demon sounds like a terrifying prospect, especially because the boss fight against old King Elant is one of the best and hardest in the game. But this one is just flat and ridiculously easy, with nary any mechanical depth or challenge. So, what are your thoughts on this? Go ahead and share them in the comments below. And if you liked this video, please subscribe to the channel and enable all notifications by clicking the bell icon to get new video updates. We upload every day and would really appreciate your support. Thanks for watching.